broadly speaking, we've got 4 work packages, and the first one related to other packages we heard yesterday. We're also doing what's called MRIO, or multi-region input-output analysis for the Swiss economy and its linkages to the global economy. Recall that the Swiss economy is small and open. Part of the goal here, though, is actually to bring this down to cantonal level as well. We're then combining this with what's called projection analysis, so taking that same data, moving the world economy forward and getting a sense of how those footprints would then evolve over time in terms of resource usage. Also, given that we've got competition and changes in other countries, demographic changes and so on, that will also drive the linkages between the Swiss economy and its parts and how resources are used from elsewhere. Armed with those 2 things, the intent is then to look at policy options. And this is partly where the lawyers come in, and then also where the computational work meets with the law. So partly they're then looking at different instruments. We heard yesterday that on the consumption side, Switzerland's not doing as well as it is on the production side in terms of resource usage. This does show up in doing these kinds of analysis of the resource composition of Swiss consumption. And so part of what we will look at is consumption-based instruments as opposed to production targets, both in an economic sense, how they work, but then operationally, how do you do that? And what's important here is the fact that not only is the Swiss economy tied up economically in global value chains, it's tied up in legal chains too. There's lots of different treaty obligations, commercially, environmentally. The WTO recently issued a compendium that's a matrix that maps from trade agreements to environmental agreements. It's about this thick. And so there's a question of what you think would work economically and what you may be allowed to do without getting litigated against. And that also then points to where Switzerland maybe can take a lead in terms of trying to identify changes in those treaty structures and the frameworks by which we jointly govern both the way the global economy works economically, but then also the rules that guide how we can deal with climate policy at the same time. And then also we're going to be looking at voluntary options, including green standards, where we both have agencies in Switzerland engaged in proliferating these things globally, but also how they may work for Swiss industry. Goals here is to better informing public policy, development of not just historic and current benchmarks, but how those may evolve moving forward and how different policy instruments might feed back on changing those benchmarks. And then identifying optimal sustainability options, given that we have both sets of social and economic objectives and that we have constraints that we may have to adjust. And so we have to think about how to go back and rewrite some of the rules letting us do what we do. In terms of what we're doing then, so these Swiss sustainability these inventories, which again will be public, updated periodically, and I've realized already visiting the sessions yesterday and sitting in this room that we need to talk to some of the other work packages. I think there's room for synergies. There's clearly room for synergies here. This integrated economic and legal analysis to identify what might actually be done. In addition, also because Switzerland is not in a vacuum, to the extent that we see policy instruments being implemented elsewhere, the EU is an obvious example, but the US as well, how does that impact in turn on the economy here in terms of resource use here? And then again, focusing on private standards and looking at the regulatory system. I think I will stop at the gong should go in a minute or two, but the packages, we think we touch on all the different modules that are intended in the overall project. I haven't heard much yet on the legal side. I think this is important in terms of understanding what the institutional constraints are. And I think this whole dimension in terms of Switzerland's role in the treaty structure that we have is important. And so again, I think talking to some of the other packages and teams is something we're going to pursue. So I'll stop with that.